Hello. 6 years after Chinese President Xi Jinping elaborated on the vision of building a community with a shared future for humanity. Well, the concept is won wider international support. What does this concept mean for a planet faced with common challenges, such as growing uncertainties and destabilizing factors? What are China's solid and concrete solutions to cope with the global challenges? And how is BRI contributing to sustainable development for the world? To talk about these and much more, I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Zhao Hai from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and Sadrina Duwimanga from China-Africa Business Council. We shall also talk to Fraser Cameron, Director of EU Asia Center in Brussels, and Professor Joe F. Toker from American Graduate School in Paris via satellite. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. So I want to start with you, Mr. Zhao. Since President Xi raised the vision 6 years ago, the international politics has changed. There is Brexit, there is America First, the president, and there is BRI. How is the world different from 6 years ago?
Well, I think the world has been going through structural changes for many years now, and some of the symptoms emerged in recent years and make it more significant. So the basic structural change is what we call the rise of the non-Western world, with more and more countries growing their own economy and participating in the global governance. In that respect, the global structure it has been changing gradually. And then, because of the uneven distribution of wealth around the globe and the problem with globalization as it is, there has been growing problems within Western countries like America, like in Britain and European countries. So you combine these forces together, you have a more fragmented and more confrontational world today. And some of the countries you have the rising nationalism in Western countries, and then also in some of the non-Western countries. And then you also have the conflict between the rich and poor and some of the uncoordinated domestic politics in all these countries.
And do you think Mr. Xi's vision about a community of shared future is the right answer to the problems in the world?
Absolutely. I think it's on the right time, and it is the right answer. First of all, it is on the right time because at this moment, the world seems to be getting far away from each other instead of getting together. And the globalization conception has been challenged. And China trying to replace that with the idea of this shared future community. And it's the right answer because we're not in this world trying to argue with each other, fight with each other in a zero-sum game. And China trying to present a solution of a win-win situation in which both of our countries along the Belt and Road and also around the globe can work together toward peace and prosperity.
And Sadrina, talking about the Belt and Road, of course, Africa is a big part of this plan. And many African countries talk to me, they say Belt and Road obviously has brought benefits to African people. But what do African business people and government think about the Chinese overture?
I think the African governments and African enterprises are also on board. But I would like to point out that actually at the beginning, when the Belt and Road initiative was launched, it felt like the Eastern African countries mostly were the ones that were going to be included, and slowly, specifically, it was very obvious last year's FOCAC that the Belt and Road now encompasses the entire continent, and that is good news for most African governments.
So you're saying it is moving to the west of Africa?
The entire continent. Okay. So most business forums or any activities that talks about China-Africa tends to have Belt and Road going with them, and most entrepreneurs and investors, Chinese investors, also go with the idea of Belt and Road. So it is now China-Africa is under Belt and Road, and that is also good news. It's well received.
And that vision itself is about commonality of the whole world. But we understand there are scores of countries in Africa. How can you find common grounds in terms of infrastructure and economic growth with the help of China?
I think dialogue is very important. I think knowledge of each other's business practice is also very important. So the past years, even before Belt and Road was initiated, most of the dialogue was taking place between so Chinese state and African government states. But now we see that dialogue going down. We see Chinese investors wanting to sit down. Even the business council I work on, we are wanting to cooperate and work more with African entrepreneurs because it's going down from governments to people, and that is what this concept is all about.
And do you feel that the China's experience and China's solution actually work as a bridge for different parts of Africa in terms of their integration?
It can. So I don't think when we talk about solutions, I think it's a diverse package. Some of the practices and experiences are fit for some of the countries. Some of the solutions may not be fit. So I think it's up to you're also dealing with an entire continent of 54 countries. So it's up to seeing what solutions are applicable to which part of Africa, which country, and others that may not be fit. And all of that goes through, experiments and dialogue, as I mentioned earlier.
All right. I know that President Xi is now visiting Europe and is definitely trying to make an overture to the Europeans about building a community of shared future. For that, let's talk to Mr. Joab Toker. So, Mr. Toker, President Xi chose to visit Italy for the first foreign trip this year. And many say this will herald a new age for China-EU relations. What do you make of the Europeans' sentiment about China's reaching out to the Europeans?
Well, this is, as we all know, a procedure which is taking place for some time. But coming back to the very first question you put to the show in its European sense, I mean, what has been altered and changed over the last 6 to 10 years, I would say that when it comes to Europe, the EU as a structure has been weakened, both globally in terms of the entire structure of the European Union and the level of its cohesion, and in parallel, we have a relative weakening of individual members of the EU for different reasons, some of them internal, some of them of global implications, which means that the European Union, which anyway and historically and traditionally had problems in terms of the cohesion of its presence, especially when it came to diplomacy and defense issues, namely the way Europe deals or should deal with the rest of the world, it was always traditionally from the beginning of the EU at the half of the 20th century it was problematic. It is more problematic today than yesterday. Now, when it comes to Italy and President Xi's first country he visits over this three-country state visit in Europe, Italy has a particular situation within an overall EU particular situation, because as you may know, Italy is in some kind of conflictual situation with Brussels, EU central institutions. There's a very particular type of government in Italy which actually unites the extreme left and the extreme right, if I cut the long story short and just put the essence of it. And everything is happening in Italy and elsewhere in Europe in an overall atmosphere which awaits an election campaign.
So you are saying that
in view of the
Europe
May
is in phasing of
for the
those
European
divisive
Parliament.
forces. But my question is China model and China solution a rallying force, or may bring more divisions to Europe, as many Europeans worry?
You know, the way the Europeans perceive the messages of Chinese foreign policy and Chinese economic policy and Chinese global approach is filtered through many things about which history is intervening, about which the distance is intervening. Although we are in a global world which is becoming smaller and smaller, China is still the other side of the world, and China belongs to a civilization which is far away from the West European transatlantic one. So all this intervenes you have to add to that filtering situation the fact that the European Union is suffering from, or actually benefiting of a growth rate which is less, smaller and weaker than that of the US on one hand, and China even more so. So the Europeans are extremely cautious when they try to interpret what actually comes out from Beijing. So there's a lot of suspicion, there's a lot of things which are just calming down as years pass by. But the overall initial approach is that of caution and that of posing questions and dealing with question marks. What do the Chinese really want? Ask many observers and many politicians in Europe.
And Sandrina, I want your take on how do Africans look at the suspicions and the divisions in Europe, and also the trade-off talks between China and the U.S.?
I think you can find different views. I think you can find, like any human being, I think we have the capacity to look at it and see opportunity. But then there is also, I guess many are aware of the presence of the relationship between the West and Africa is historical, it's deep, and the media is also very important. You can sit in a small town in Uganda and follow Fox News, and or in Madagascar and watch France 24 very regularly. So the influence of the media is also strong. So what's expressed from the West reaches the ears of a lot of Africans, and as an effect, then you have a diverse way of looking at things. You have business.
But do you believe they can work together in Africa and elsewhere in the world?
We hope. I think Africans would hope not to fall into divisions and actually think about cooperation.
Well, there's a big caveat, Mr. Zhao. That is the U.S.-China trade talks. Many people worry, what will the prospect be? Is it going to be a two parallel universe in the future if the U.S. and China continue to stand out in this way?
I don't believe so, but the reason lies in the answers that you and the professor gave just now. I think the world, yes, the world is getting smaller because of technology and because of the globalization process. But at the same time, the problem created today are created by this process. And because these problems are intensifying, in order to find the solutions, we have to go back to the origin, right? So currently, because we're getting closer, so for instance, the immigration problem, the common threat of health, the common threat of climate change, we have to face those in with a united front.
But the problem is, in what approach? Do we set up walls and barriers so that we can keep ourselves safe, or we reach across barriers?
That's exactly the point. What I'm trying to point out is that actually those solutions are temporary, short-term solutions. Yes, maybe you build a wall, maybe you set up some kind of firewall, whatever wall that you're trying to wall off the threat, but the threat is still there. Climate change is still there, common threat is still there. So we have to unite together and tear down the walls, and also trying to find a common solution. And China is trying to provide China's development experience and try to provide the world that will have what we have been successful to help other countries, developing countries, also European countries, to get together.
Okay, we have Mr. Cameron also on the line. Can we talk to Mr. Fraser Cameron from Brussels? Mr. Cameron, of course, this is two visions about whether we should continue globalization or we should backpedaling this process. What do you think, and what are the Europeans, the majority of the Europeans, are for?
Well, you can't put the globalization genie back in the bottle. That's impossible. I think the majority of Europeans have benefited from globalization, but just as in America and elsewhere, there's a minority, usually the lesser educated, less skilled, who have not benefited from it. And politicians have been slow to recognize that this poses a political problem. So I think globalization going forward must address those who have really lost out, and that is what we have to do in Europe to try and stem the rise of populism in Europe.
And when President Xi made a speech in Davos in 2017, he basically said we should still band together to continue this process. But there are blowbacks. In the United States, they fear that the trade is not working for them. In Europe, they also worry Chinese technology and investment may compromise their sovereignty and integrity. What do you think of the conversation?
Well, it's quite natural in an era of growing economic interdependence. There's many different views about the pros and cons of working with different countries. I mean, the reality is that the US, the EU and China are the three biggest blocs in the world. They're all very much interdependent now. And in terms of the EU-China relationship, that's grown enormously in the last decade now, and both sides benefit enormously from it. And inevitably, when you have a relationship as big as this, there are going to be a few problem areas, but normally we work through them and come to a solution.
Mr. Toker, when Mr. Xi visits Rome and Paris and Monaco, he's basically saying that we should allow more Chinese investment and also technology into the European markets. Some people in Europe worry that that will put European countries in debt they cannot afford. On the other hand, it will buy influence from the Chinese for the longer term. Should that something we should worry about from the European perspective?
I don't think we should worry about that. I think we should be aware of it on both sides of the globe in order to better understand and better follow up what is happening. Don't forget that in Europe, contrary to what the situation is both in China and in the US, we're speaking about high unemployment rates. For a very long time, the discourse of many politicians on the left and on the right was that watch it, jobs are taken away from us, from Europe, in favor of Asia and other emerging countries. And this discourse, although it had weakened to some extent over the last few years, is still valid, is still circulating in the public sphere, and is still influencing overall public opinion tendencies as well as political initiatives.
All right, you're now watching a program on Dialogue. We're talking about the 60th anniversary of President Xi's vision for a future with common destiny for mankind. Don't go away. We'll be right back. And since 6 years ago, Chinese President raised the idea, China obviously has taken a more assertive, should I say, proactive role in global governance. For example, China has been providing more humanitarian aid to Africa, to Syria, and also China has been trying to step up to the international arena by providing more public good. How do the rest of the world think of China's growing role?
I think the previous years have been, the idea has been challenged. I think initially it was received very well, but then with the previous, what I said previously about the media and mostly coming from the West, I think it's been challenged in many ways, which doesn't prove that it's not a good concept. It just means that we have both China and Africa have to do a better job at branding what's already taking place. I just came from Madagascar, and I was very impressed with some of the work that, even though I work in the field, like some of the work that are, you know, amazing, that has not really been put forward. So I think we have to do a better job at research. I was just having a conversation with Professor Zhao about how to increase our research centers, even on the continent, to be able to reach and see what's being done and put forward and bring it in the discourse in order to create a balanced conversation and narrative when we talk about our relationship.
And Mr. Zhao, do you share understandings about some of the people in the West about China's growing influence and leverage in global affairs?
Well, China certainly has growing influence in global affairs, and China has displayed a willingness to shoulder more global responsibility and provide more public goods. However, it is wrong to suggest that somehow the Belt and Road Initiative, China is the only initiator and is only the one that's been benefited. And there are some people, you have also mentioned that these people are spreading misinformation and bias that China is practicing predatory economic measures. I think those are wrong, because if you look at what happened on the ground, without exaggeration, without misinformation, there's, generally speaking, very positive results for the countries who are involved in the Belt and Road Initiative.
But they say this programs or initiatives serve China better than their partners. Do you think it is legitimate complaint?
Well, as long as both sides benefit. If China benefited more initially or in the overall relationship, that's probably because China invests more. But overall, I think the relationship is balanced. It depends on how much the other party wanted to chip in, basically to invest in this project. If your investment more, for instance, some of the African countries, they believe in this project investment more, and then their trade with China actually grow much faster than the trade China export to them. So I think overall, it depends on the willingness and the idea of how to participate, how to connect with China's Belt and Road.
And geopolitically, if it is a market-based environment, everybody makes profits according to what kind of investment they make. But geopolitically, do you think China is buying more influence in Africa and Europe and want to change or influence the local politics, as many people worry?
I don't think China buy influence. The influence growing naturally because of China's presence, because of China's trade and economic relationship, aid, public goods provided in the region. So I think overall it's a balanced relationship. Again, I think it's important for China to let the world know what we have been doing. For instance, the UN peacekeeping force, China has been the #1 contributor. However, not many people outside of China knew that factor. So.
Mr. Cameron, I want your take on this question, because there is a recent report from the European Commission saying that China is a systematic rival to Europe, to the European Union. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, just like the United States is a systematic rival in many areas too to the European Union. Don't forget, President Trump recently described the European Union as a foe when it came to trade matters. So inevitably there are competition between the major powers in international trade. But equally, in terms of cooperation, we all benefit when there are multilateral rules to be respected, particularly in the WTO. And that's what the European Union has been, at the moment, emphasizing both with China and the United States.
So you believe it is benign competition?
Largely benign, yes. I mean, the world has hugely benefited from globalization. I mean, in the last couple of years, the US has taken a different turn by imposing tariffs both on China and the European Union. But hopefully that's not going to be a continuation, and that we reach deals on both sides of the Atlantic and between Washington and Beijing soon.
And a lot of people in America worry the fundamental interests of America and China are incompatible. At least more and more people in America think so. Is it also the similar worry in Europe?
No, I mean, we have different political systems, and as long as you accept that and manage that, there's no incompatibility, as long as you, as I say, respect the rules. I mean, the EU and China are working together in many areas, not just on trade, but also on dealing with Iran, for example, dealing with climate change, with ocean governance. I mean, it's a huge list of common issues. And inevitably there are going to be some problem areas, and some areas where we see things differently. The South China Sea is one, human rights is another. But the point is, you have to manage these disputes and work through them.
Let's talk another area that we may not agree on. That is the investment rules. China wants to invest in infrastructure and the 5G telecommunication technologies. Some European countries, probably under the influence of America, have qualms about whether they should come aboard. What do you think of this?
The United States has been lobbying, but it's not had an overall positive impact, I would say, in Europe. The UK has taken a different decision, and Germany is still reflecting, but I don't think it's automatically going to follow the US line, and neither is France or Italy. So I think each country will look at the overall situation. Next week, the European Commission is going to publish some guidelines as to how Europe should respond to the overall implications of going down the 5G network. So I think the US is taking its own route. Europe will also take its own position.
Mr. Toker, okay, we have lost Mr. Toker there. I still want to continue our conversation with Mr. Cameron. What do you think of the areas that China and the U.S. and China EU interests align are similar, and what are the areas that not so similar?
Well, with the Trump administration, it's increasingly difficult to find areas where we're all together, because previously I would have said automatically climate change. So this was pushed when the Obama administration was in power, and of course it's one of the top priorities for the EU and increasingly China. I think too, Iran, that was an area where we were all agreed, but now Trump has taken a different position as well. So in many areas, strangely, you could argue that the EU and China have more in common on some global issues compared to the EU and the United States, or China and the United States. And the big question we're all looking at is, will this change back again in 18 months' time if Trump is defeated at the election, or will he be re-elected and we have to adjust to another 4 years of America First policies in the White House?
And Mr. Toker, if Italy sign up to the Belt and Road Initiative, it will probably become the first G7 country to do that. Do you think it will have ripple effects and affect the decisions of other advanced economies?
Yes, I think it may. It will certainly work this way, in this direction, taking into considerations other elements and other ingredients which participate in a decision-making process regarding economic, long-range infrastructure type of issues. But I'm not sure it's going to alter the basic ingredients on the basics of which European public opinions and different European governments making their overall view of those global overall relations between China and the EU. And of course, the triangle context we have already mentioned, namely US, EU, China, of course complicates things even further in this rather confused, sometimes bizarre period regarding the EU-Trump, the EU-US relations. Although I would be cautious and would not compare on equal grounds the two wings of this triangle, because I think that the relations which indeed link Northern America with Western Europe, with Europe in general, are well more profound than those which link China with the US or China with Europe. And we should take that into consideration. You know, there are deep waters in the ocean, and there are all kinds of agitations of waves on the surface. And the Trump period perhaps may represent, in larger perspective, the types of stormy waves on the surface, but would not alter the deep, profound characteristics of transatlantic relations.
Well, that's very important insight. Thank you, Mr. Toker, and thank you, Mr. Cameron. But Mr. Zhao, just very soon, in April, the second Belt and Road Forum will be held in Beijing. Is this going to be a follow-up on the first forum and the 6 years ago, the vision for President Xi, or are there going to be new development?
I think there will be new development. It's not a simple follow-up because after 5-6 years of experience, China has been modifying and updating the whole Belt and Road project. And you have seen that there are different patterns of investment, different consideration of connectivity infrastructure projects. And in terms of, for instance, the China-Pakistan economic corridor, there's been changes as well. So I think both China and other countries participating in the BRI are adapting to the new situation. And this, the second forum will have to reflect on that and think about how to move forward and how to discover new opportunities and adjust the old projects.
It is an ongoing process.
It's ongoing, yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Zhao. Thank you, Sabrina, for your insights. Thank you. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm Zoe in Beijing. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye for now.